Hey, greetings, everybody. I'm going to try to briefly recount the history and evolution of the Mark series amplifiers. And I hope I can remember stuff and I hope I can be mostly accurate and correct. Um, so here we go. Of course, it really starts with boosting the little Princetons and the Princeton reverbs by taking out all of the electronics, all of the transformers, replacing them with the great big transformers and either 2 or 4 6L6s, taking out the little 10-inch speaker and cutting out the cabinet to fit in a JBL D120 was my kind of favorite, and everything had to be exactly right to get it all in there and keep the thing totally stock looking. Well, that started a trend, and I ended up converting everyone in the Bay Area, I think, because as you might remember from an earlier podcast, one of the first guys to play was Carlos Santana, and he plugged into the thing at our Prune Music store and was blown away. And at the end, he said, "Shit, man, that little thing really boogies." And so that became the name, the Boogie. So you get your amp boogieized. And like I said, we did all kinds of those and then started ordering them from Fender, and I would strip them. Uh, and then it occurred to me that makes no sense. You're buying a new amp from Fender, taking out everything and keeping only the bare chassis and the cabinet. So I said, I'm going to start making my own, which I did. Um, that was step number one, the high powered compact 112 combo. Step number two was getting high gain, and that was a discovery or an invention that I have to credit Lee Michaels for. Again, he's still a pal. He was a revolutionary guy in the area, trying all kinds of crazy stuff. And several people had been unable to make adequate preamps for his Crown DC 300s, which were burst upon the scene as these almost laboratory devices, these really high power stereo transistor amplifiers. And so he said, "Hey, Randy, you want to give it a try? Fenders didn't work, acoustics didn't work. This other high tech company, they all sounded like garbage. They didn't sound right." So me not knowing exactly what to do, I took my favorite Bassman 410 Bassman preamp circuit and added another stage of amplification at the output end of it, and put a sequence of 3 level controls down the signal chain. So that because I knew, wow, this is going to overload, this is going to be too much, but let's start with too much and then back it up. Well, when we got a thing working, we realized a couple of groundbreaking occurrences. Number one, it had this gain that no one had ever heard before, up to 80 times the amount of gain that a normal amplifier would have. Number two, you finally had a separation from overdrive distortion and playing loudness. And I can't tell you how important that was at the time, because in order to get a blues or rock sound with some distortion on it, the only way you could do that was to turn your amp up too loud, which meant you needed a different power and loudness amp for every different size venue. As illustrated when our guitar player, Lizard Slim, went out and bought a full Marshall stack, and in order to get his tone, he had to have it up so loud that basically we had no more band sound. And people who left the club with their ears bleeding. But this was a huge problem. At any rate, so solved both of those problems. And man, when we turned up the front end to have all of this gain down the signal chain and then turn the tiny down the output, you had this endless sustain at a whisper volume. Now, this was new. I can't impress upon you now how radical that was at the time. So I'm thinking, wow, that's what Carlos needs, man, because he still has these issues with a man. I couldn't get enough sustain last night. I want a sound that holds like a violin or a saxophone, that's rich with harmonics and it sustains. It doesn't go plink and die out like an acoustic guitar string does. And man, this does it. Okay, then I'm thinking, yeah, but with this added gain stage at the back end, the output end of the signal chain, there's no way that you're going to be able to get it to work like a normal amp very well. Um, And so then it occurred to me, oh, put that overdrive stage at the front end and then have two different input jacks, one that's at the normal spot, which would be after the booster stage, and one that's the new high gain that's before the booster stage. And I came up with, luckily, a clever way to do that using, and I stressed on this really hard, to find a way so that merely plugging into input one turned on and connected the overdrive stage. And when you didn't have that on, not only did input two access the normal amount of Fendery gain, but you didn't have noise, oscillation, and interference coming from that preamp stage. Okay, again, now remember, there weren't pedals in those days to do this. Now there are, but then there weren't. The only thing that even tried to do that was the famous fuzz face, which sounded like a mosquito on Viagra. And it was really, like a kind of a gimmicky thing that you might want to put on for a sound effect, like Satisfaction has it on there. But for music, no. And immediately, these amplifiers, I was shocked how fast the world picked them up. Major stars, Larry Carlton, George Harrison, Carlos Santana himself, the Studio Cats down in L.A. I mean, it was Rolling Stones. It was getting out worldwide really fast. Again, a good part due to my friend Carlos touring behind the Abraxas album with this little 112 combo with this endless sustain. And everybody's going, wow, what is that? How do you do that? Okay. So, and I remember the day that Carlos came out to my house in Lagunitas and said, yeah, Randy, that I love this amp, but man, wouldn't it be cool if I could just switch back to a regular clean sound? And I said, oh, man, you guitar players, I love you, but you're never satisfied. So I started working on that, and that became the Mark II. And once we had the Mark II, then the Boogie amp was known from then on as the Mark I. And again, I made around 3,000 of those in the house in Lagunitas, and we shipped to 37 different foreign countries. Like I said, it kind of took the industry by storm because it was so radical and it was adopted so quickly by major players. Okay, so the Mark II, that came later, and the date, it's on here as around 1978, whereas the Mark I started more like 71 or 2. Again, these are approximate dates. I can't really. And it looks like from this history that somebody put together that we made about 2,800 of the Mark IIs. That would be called the Mark IIA. And then it was followed by the Mark IIB because I was trying to get, I always listened to what guitar players had to say, and I tried to accommodate their fantasies and their desires. By the way, the 2B remains one of my favorites for its overdrive sound because it's not unlike the 2C Plus, which actually became much more famous. The 2C Plus had this really heavy sound. The 2B did not. It sounded more like blues and rock, and you could really much more hear the characteristic of the guitar in it. And I'll never forget being at a race back in Wisconsin with my pal Gil Nickel. We flew back in his Learjet, believe it or not, and I spoke to this on another podcast earlier. But that event in Elkhart Lake, it was a huge event, and the race cars drove up into the major town, and the whole town shut down and had this party. And I'm hearing outdoors with these thousands of people, I'm hearing the greatest guitar sound and a really good player. And I'm fighting my way through the crowd to find out what is that. And it is a Mark II-B 112 combo, no mic, no PA, soaring over the crowd. And when they took a break, I started talking to the guy and introduced myself. And man, I mean, we were both just really gratified because I was like, wow, no shit. That was tone for days. Okay, now, those amps used a relay to switch the extra gain stage and the controls into the circuit. This became patent number 4211893, the most important one of all the ones that I've gotten, and the one most copied and ignored, especially when we got up to CBS. Anyway, that's another story that I talked about earlier. But the problem with the relay was that if you were playing when you switched, it made a big pop. If you weren't playing, and if you stopped for that moment and hit the foot switch, it actually didn't pop. This was a problem. Okay, one of the copies was the Fender 75. And, well, it was a totally infringing copy, but it didn't have the pop in it. And I was looking at it, and they had these little weird devices I'd never seen before. They were LDRs. That stands for light dependent resistor. So instead of the relay being a hard switch, the light dependent resistor went shoo as the resistance changed, and that's how it avoided the pop. And it had, I don't know, 4 or 5 of them in the Fender 75. So I sought about finding these things. It is an LED and a light dependent resistor in a little light tight package with 4 leads sticking out from it. And that was one of the driving forces to doing the 2C. And I also wanted to improve the effects loop if possible. And his interesting bit of history, I was working with one of the cats there at Boogie, a guy named Jim Casero, and he was toning while I was, working on the circuit. And we thought it sounded pretty darn good. That would become known as the C minus. Okay, so I had to take an Asian Pacific tour trip. This may have been the one where I signed up the Japanese, I can't remember, but several countries in the Asian Pacific Rim. I was gone for a long time, and during that time, Doug West came to work at Boogie, and he and Mike Bendinelli improved the 2C, and that became the 2C plus. They made it sound better, and they made the effects loop work better. So thank you, fellas, for that. Couldn't get the reverb to work, and I did that when I came back to figure out how to get the reverb to work and work in both of those modes. And again, it had its pluses and its minuses. And here's where, once again, we get into this realm where the engineering and accidents sort of coalesce, and sometimes accidents are where the gold lies. Here's a couple of examples. One is that due to just the physical constraints of making the mods on this existing C minus board, one of the 12AX7s, which, as you guys know, each glass tube has 2 functional triode units. So, but one of them shared half of the reverb and half of the overdrive, and the other 12AX7 shared the other half of the overdrive and the other half of the reverb. And it turned out that was actually a happy accident. Perhaps, now we tried to run this down later because there was in Doug's ear, and man, he is tone king, there was some little harmonic up there, which I traced down later to be bleed within the tube envelope from the reverb send being overdriven so hard it was bleeding into part of the overdrive stage in a way that he liked. And yet, on the other hand, several of the most famous amps, including Metallica's Crunchberries, weren't even reverb, so they didn't have that. That was not even possible. I mentioned this because when the Mark III came up, there were 3 big things different about that. Number one, I wanted to add another mode that was in between gain, because I was listening to Eddie Van Halen and thinking, yeah, it's neither high gain nor low gain. It's an amp with lowered line voltage, so it overdrives easier. It's a Marshall, of course. And it's turned up really loud. And it's a beautiful sound. It's the Brown sound. So I modified the clean sound in order to achieve that, and it worked pretty well. The other things were I wanted to save some weight. Everybody was complaining about how heavy the amps were. Well, a couple of reasons for that. Number one, almost all of the Mark combos had EVM speakers with giant heavy magnets on them. The other main source of weight was the power transformer, and it had quite a big stack of the iron laminations. So I called my engineer friends at Schumacher and asked them, is there any way that we can save weight on this? And the guy said, heck yeah. He said, that's just a big pile of the lowest grade iron you can get, which of course was what Fender had been using. And my transformers basically evolved from theirs anyway, with some modifications, but the same basic design. And the guy said, yeah, what you should use instead is this grain-oriented silicon steel, and we can reduce that stack of heavy iron by over half and still have the same amount of magnetic flux. I said, great, let me see some samples. So I sent out some samples, and man, they check out great. The static the voltages at idle are exactly the same. The voltages under load, the sag is exactly the same. Everything is exactly the same. So man, and they don't weigh nearly as much. So in they go into the Mark III. Now, years later, again, a Carlos Santana request. He digs up some old amp that, some old Boogie that he realizes he had recorded at Budokan in Tokyo on. And he said, man, can you dupe that? And I said, oh man, come on. We can't just make one amp. We need to make a bunch. At any rate, that became the King Snake. But as we analyzed that, we realized, and we swapped transformers back and forth, we said, wow, the attack envelope is different between the big pile of low-grade iron and the little stack of high-grade steel. The steel sounds more bang, it's more instantaneous. And the iron is more like quang. So again, are we neurotic? Hell yeah, we are. This is musical instrument stuff. But it was noticeable. So we went back, and of course that no longer complies with the safety regulations, so it was a huge hassle. But we insisted on using a big pile of the low-grade iron, and eventually we got a design that copped that same dynamic envelope and once again was compliant with the ever-changing regulatory nightmares that are imposed mostly from Europe in an effort to keep their engineers employed. Has nothing to do with safety, in my humble opinion. Because again, after all of the amps that we made, there has never been even one case of a safety-related failure, not one, and it's basically impossible. Even the UL guy said that. He said the first time he looked at it, he said, oh, I like this. Everything is metal and is grounded, and the transformer is enclosed in steel, so no threat of shock or fire hazard. And I said, great, are we finished? And he said, oh, no, we haven't even gotten started here yet. At any rate, that little diversion. Okay, so there's the Mark III. There was also another little change there. To save space, I changed and gave up the original circuit board that had been in every amplifier for the 4.6L6s. And believe it or not, we discovered later, years later, a happy accident in that will remain a trade secret. That also had a little influence in the dynamic attack envelope of the amplifier. And so that changed in the Mark III. Now, before you think that the Mark III suck and that transformer was a disaster, it ain't true. There's a lot of people, including John Petrucci, who find amazing tones out of a Mark III. The other thing, that very transformer was the transformer that was in all of the rectifiers, the dual and the triples. So there's no way to say that that transformer was a piece of dog meat. No, it wasn't. Again, everything is a trade-off, and everything influences the tone if you get neurotic enough. So what's the tone you're going for? Well, in the rectos, a little more hard-hitting and faster tone. If you're trying to recreate a more vintage sound, it's the opposite. And that goes to the resistors, the capacitors, all the stuff where we compare each kind of different resistor, metal film, carbon comp in most critical places and throughout the amp. I mean, we go into detail. You ask the other people, well, we use the cheapest ones, of course, don't you? They're all the same. Yeah, if you're making a garage door opener, it doesn't matter. There is no tonal difference. Okay, so then, but see, these amps still, yes, you could foot switch between clean, a boosted clean, which would be the in-between gain, and the high gain sound, but you still had the shared set of tone controls. So the Mark IV attempted to improve that. And when I look back now, it's kind of complicated how it does it, because it doesn't really give you full optional independence between the channels. It tries to. It gives you the more important ones, like the treble control, were way more important. And so that was cured on the Mark V. Hey, wait a second here. Let me show you something. Here's a picture of the Mark V circuit board. Well, it actually is the Mark V circuit board drawing. You see all that work there? That's what I do. That's fun. You think? Yeah. So that is a double-sided plated through circuit board. Those big circles are where the 12AX7 preamp tubes go. Yeah. So that's part of the art. And again, those circuit boards, once you get that right and use the board to actually create the sound and get it stable and solid, then you're good to go. Speaking of that, now I'm going to go back to the recent 2C Plus, because the last project that I worked on at Gibson was, well, it was after Gibson took over Boogie, before I got the boot, was the 2C Plus reissue. And the first version, yeah, it sounded good, but it wasn't stable due to some of the layout characteristics. So if you turned everything up, it had a tendency to squeal. So I did it all over again. I was looking at where's the squealing coming from and rearranged all the parts and stuff. So this is an example of building a high gain musical amplifier. It's not just straightforward. And also, by the way, it also copped these weird things about the half of the real reverb shared with half of the overdrive. It got all of that back in there. It got the weird deal that we discovered about the about the 6L6s. That was something that, again, another happy accident that goes all the way back to the very first, what became known as Mark I amplifiers. The other thing that's in the 2C reissue is provisions for the plus mod, which is really just a couple of parts values that are changed, and then a resistor and a cap, as I recall. That stuff, I figured, okay, somebody wants to get the plus. Same thing, there it is right there on the board. Put the parts on. So it's really a mod more than a model. And yeah, it has its pluses and minuses. Some people are addicted to gain, and the more you give them, the more they want. But then again, at a certain point, you compromise the ability for other sounds, which the Mark IIc Plus really has a wide palette. It's not just a heavy metal machine. I could call it a heavy mental machine because it really can, it can do everything. It really is a great sounding amplifier. Now, the only thing that I think surpasses it is the Mark VII. What about the Mark VI? Well, there is one Mark VI, and that was the prototype for the Mark VII. We didn't like the number 6. I should say Doug mostly didn't like the number 6. I kind of agree with him. And Tommy Waugh said, man, that amp is so good, it deserves to skip one. And so we all agreed on, let's call it the Mark VII. And it had the it had its own mode, which we were tempted to call the Mark VI mode in the Mark VII, even though there never was a Mark VI. At any rate, I think Gibson talked us off the ledge there. That might have been the kind of crazy stuff we would have done in the old days. Like, well, what do you mean it's got the Mark VI mode? There never was a Mark VI. At any rate, I dreamed up a few things. And again, I just, the Mark VII circuit board, I wish I had a picture like that one I just showed you, because it's actually better and fewer parts, which is often go together. Simplicity being the hardest thing to achieve. So, yes, it's got the 2C plus mode in all of its glory, the same thing as that is in the C plus itself, including the transformers, all of the tricky, weird stuff. It's got the 2B in there, and man, that is a hit mode. Down in Texas, they're going crazy over that because, again, it is a Texas blues mode that can do almost anything you want. So I don't know. I think, especially since I don't work there anymore, the Mark VII, that's my swan song. That's it. And I think it's the culmination. And the goal was this. Okay, modeling is out there. So, you can get dozens, 100, who knows, unlimited numbers of different sounds. But really, how about just the ones that inspire you to play? The ones that when you play the amplifier, it gives you something back that removes the scales from your eyes. It makes your fingers move. It makes your ears dance, and you're inspired to play. That's what we do. And no offense to the modeling guys, that's a whole new technology. Yeah, great, but it's never going to completely supplant the source of the sounds that they model, lots of which came from Petaluma and Lagunitas. And as you know, if you look at that Mark VII, it does have IR recording outputs that is phenomenal. So the point I'm trying to get to with the Mark VII is that it's the real thing. In fact, I thought it should be promoted, and it never got the promotion that it deserved. The promotion should have said, "Get real," because that's what it is. It's the real deal. With 3 totally independent modes, each one has this complete array of tone controls, presence, masters, gain, and controllable switches for the EQ. Everything is all there. Don't be intimidated any more than you would be intimidated when you look at a mixing console and you see, oh my God, look at all of those knobs. Yeah, right. Look at one channel. And actually, a mixing console has one channel, has a lot more knobs than one channel of the guitar amp of the Mark VII. But all 3 channels are identical. So you've got this full independence, and it's the same thing 3 times. So you don't have to learn words. It's somewhat like the Mark IV, again, an evolutionary step that didn't make the whole leap. And this is me learning as I go, not giving up. Everything gets better. And man, it's been a pleasure. It's been a life. I love you guitar players. You're always on the quest. And, 2C plus, get them. But also, don't overlook that Mark VII, man, because it is all there, and you will never need anything else, guaranteed. Okay, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your comments and for making my life as amazing as it's been. Talk to you later. Thank you. Bye.